Official opposition.
Thank you, Speaker. Sexual assault service providers and advocates across this province have called upon this government to implement a sexual assault strategy to address the issue of sexualized violence. The Minister for the Status of Women assured us in 2011 that the government was aggressively working on a strategy. Yesterday, when questioned in the House on this sexual assault, the Minister of Justice insulted every Nova Scotian, Mr. Speaker, with his response to the question. So my question to the Premier is, where is the sexual assault strategy?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the government is working with those who are advocates in this area and with organizations right around the province, and in fact are implementing a program which is designed to meet the needs of Nova Scotians with respect to this very important issue. The Leader of the Opposition would know that there are already in place in some parts of the province specialized medical personnel who are designed to deal particularly with those who are victims of sexual assault. He would probably already know that in the cases of those that are reported and go on to court, there are in fact services in place which are designed to support those victims and to provide them with the services that they need in order to be able to deal with these very important issues.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Speaker, we know that Nova Scotia has the highest rate of sexual assaults in Canada, Mr. Speaker, 40 assaults for every 1,000 people. So given the staggering rate of sexual assaults, Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia, and considering they were aggressively working on it in 2011, my question is, why is there no urgency from this government to act, to implement a strategy, to resource outreach initiatives, support victims, and bring aggressors to justice?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that we do all of those things already. We are, in fact, very aggressively dealing with these issues, trying to provide across the spectrum support. So it is of course not enough just to engage in the post-event remediation or remedial issues. It is also important that we are addressing what are the causes associated with it, and that is in fact what the government is seeking to do. It is a societal problem which we certainly acknowledge, and I know that that even on the reporting side, I think the reports are pretty clear that even on the ones that come to our attention, there are literally many-fold more that don't get reported, and therefore we are unable to provide the kind of help that we would wish to be able to provide.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it's been nearly 4 years. Victims, support workers, and all Nova Scotians want action. So my question to the Premier, when will Nova Scotians see a complete sexual assault strategy for Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as with any strategy or with any action plan, often we do not wait until the strategy is complete or the action plan is complete. We try to put these things in place in advance where they make sense. We have done some of that already with respect to specialized medical personnel. In fact, right across the province, those who are healthcare providers are already received training to deal with people who are victims of sexual assault, and we're going to continue to do that and not wait until there's an overall strategic framework to do that. But I would say that work is continuing. The Leader of the Opposition would know that this is a well-organized community. They, in fact, have been engaged with the government for some time on it. They have had support to, in fact, do some of the work that they are doing from the government in relation to this issue. Thank you, and thank you for the question.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today's early childhood development announcement leaves far more questions than it answers. Everyone, of course, wants the best for our children, particularly in the early years, but a true comprehensive program is both real and meaningful and accountable for results. The handbook, known and called Investing in Early Childhood Development, says, and I quote, "Accountability requires development of plans that include goals and objectives, timelines and targets, review and evaluation." I'll table that for the benefit of the Premier. My question, if the Premier is so serious about early childhood development, why are there no goals, objectives, timelines, targets, reviews or evaluation included in today's announcement?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we're working with the McCain Foundation in relation to these early years centres. They are designed on some of the best modeling anywhere, and the reason for this is that it requires actual consultation with communities to decide which services should be in each one of the early years centres. In other words, these early years centres will be tailored to the needs that the community community analysis determines. And it also means that they will be different, may be different in one community than in another, because as you know, Mr. Speaker, the needs differ in different parts of the province. In fact, they can differ in different parts of city, the size of Halifax. So, you know, all of the measures that the Leader of the Conservative Party is talking about, of course, will be part ultimately of that of our approach to the early years centres. Right now, we are working with one of the foremost expert organizations in the development of those centres.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, most people would come up with a plan and do all those things and then announce it, not announce it first and spend all of their time on the glossy cover page and a fancy new slogan and then go out and consult later. Mr. Speaker, that's how you're supposed to plan. A comprehensive early childhood development includes dealing with child poverty. Mr. Speaker, it includes dealing with nutrition and brain stimulation, among other important factors. But under the NDP, the cost of living has gone up, causing further hardship to too many of our most low-income families. Mr. Speaker, since we're talking about early childhood development, does the Premier realize that his own policies, raising taxes and power rates and making life tougher for low-income families, will also have to be reviewed if we're ever going to have a true comprehensive plan for early childhood development?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm really I'm baffled by the commentary just provided by the Leader of the Conservative Party. He seems to have missed the fact that over the last 4 years there has been more done to reorient income into the hands of low-income Nova Scotians than at any time in our past. Not only did we take the HST off of home electricity, but we also took it off of children's clothing. We also took it off of other necessities in the home. But over and above that, Mr. Speaker, we also took large pieces of the income of coming into the government from HST and transferred it to low-income Nova Scotians through the affordability tax credit, through the disability tax credit. In fact, low-income Nova Scotians are now paying much less in the way of tax than they did when the Conservatives were in power.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the whole problem is that this is a government that gives a little bit with one hand and takes a whole lot more with the other. That's why it's so tough on lower-income Nova Scotians today. But since we're talking about one hand and the other, it's also a government where the left hand and the right hand don't know what each other are doing. Today's announcement, Mr. Speaker, talks about 3 early years centres to be set up somewhere in the province, but at the same time, 30 of our smaller community schools continue to be under review with no plan in sight for how that's going to change. So I will ask the Premier, what does today's announcement say to those 30 rural communities whose schools continue to be under review?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, well, I suppose the answer to that question could go just about anyways, but I start with this. First of all, there's more money in the pockets of the low-income Nova Scotians as a result of the initiatives undertaken by this government. That's the first thing. The second thing is that to date there are 98 schools in this province where the services of provincial governments or the services of community organizations have been moved into predominantly rural schools in order to be able to make them sustainable in their communities. We want sustainable community schools. These kinds of early years centre will further enhance that initiative to make sure not only are the schools sustainable, but the people in those communities and their kids are getting the services that they require, and more so, Mr. Speaker, getting the services they deserve.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, when asked about the status of a province-wide strategy to address rape and sexualized violence, the Minister of Justice was non-committal, refused to answer my question, and then accused the opposition of not having confidence in the police. Mr. Speaker, a committee has been struck with a variety of stakeholders, including government, and has met on this strategy. So my question to the Minister, where's the work of this committee?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you for the question. The issue of, I'm not really clear of what the member is trying to get at, other than the fact that as the Premier had answered in an earlier question, that there's a number of strategies gone forward, a number of committees are met, and work is being done across, and I'll give them one example, is for example when we deal with the domestic violence court and all the componentry and how we're measuring that and trying to get the feedback and the information from there and how to expand that program where the benefits are across the province and to address what we see as a very serious problem and concern in the province.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this is not the first time I've raised this issue. I raised it with the government 16 months ago. The Minister for the Status of Women said in this House on December 6, 2011, and I'll table that response, on December 6, 2011, we are taking aggressive action. One would think that 16 months of aggressive action would at least result in a plan or a strategy to address this issue. So my question is to the Minister of Justice. What kind of aggressive action is the department taking? Why have we seen nothing addressing rape and sexualized violence?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you. Thank the member in that question. I think that would be best answered by the Minister of Health, as to that falls in his area of responsibility.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. We've taken sexual assault very seriously in the government. We recognize that it crosses many departments. So as the Minister of Health and Wellness, the department has taken the lead with my Deputy Minister to work with Deputy Ministers from Justice, from the Status of Women, Deputy Minister from Community Services, to work with stakeholders. Like Avalon Sexual Assault Centre, Mr. Speaker, we've provided a number of grants now that they support Nova Scotians through anybody who comes to their programs or through a 1-800 telephone line, Mr. Speaker. We've supported programs like the Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner in 2 parts of the province. We know we need to improve services for those individuals who find themselves a victim of sexual assault. So we're working with those partners to move forward on a number of initiatives that we already have implemented, and we're going to continue to move forward to ensure that Nova Scotians have access to the support they need, especially those individuals who might find themselves a victim of sexual violence.
The honourable member for Bedford First Cove on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I find it interesting that the Minister of Justice cannot answer this question because the Minister's website shows a picture of the Minister of Justice with representatives from women's centres who were there to talk about sexual assault services on December 7th of last year. This NDP government is 3.5 years into a majority mandate. So women and girls of Nova Scotia, here's your NDP photo op. When can Nova Scotians expect this government to put the safety of women and girls before photo ops and announce some real action to combat sexual assault?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much. I just want to reassure the member across that as a minister and as a government, we take any form of violence seriously, and that we're committed to that. And that's why we have the domestic violence plan. As you heard my colleague mention earlier, what is happening in the health area. And yes, it's a collaboration. We are working across departmental lines. We're moving funds to address the issue within departmental departments to make sure that we have a collaborative approach and working together to address these issues. And we have a very strong budget for victim services overall. There's over $3 million that go in there. We have the restorative programs that are happening around. We increased benefits to counselling. So we're committed on a number of fronts, and it's a matter of coming together and working in that collaboration to put forth the program. And the collaboration is not only within the government departments, but across all stakeholders within the community. So that's very critical that we have that open dialogue and that we work in those partnerships.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we can all recall the advice that the Minister of Education received from Dr. Wayne McKay and the warning to the Minister that steps needed to be taken immediately to try to begin to address the problem of cyberbullying. That was in February of 2012. In the Minister's own task force report, there were 3 recommendations that spoke to Internet service providers and the criminal code. The Minister's own response to that report through Bill 30 was silent on both of those issues. My question to the Minister is this: why would the Minister ignore critical, important recommendations that should have been part of her immediate response?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And we have moved forward with the recommendations from the report, and we have implemented an action plan with 40 actions in it that many have started, many are in the process of starting over the 3-year period. We have more supports in our schools. 40 actions are underway in the province of Nova Scotia to combat bullying and cyberbullying. And, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say that we have had a very serious situation in Nova Scotia, and I would like to say that our action plan is in place, but if there's other areas that we can to affect positive change, effective research-based positive change, this government is going to move forward to do them.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The recommendations that I spoke about that were in the task force report speaking to Internet service and criminal code would have gone a long way to help this province. So, Mr. Speaker, this minister has had ample opportunity, 1 full year, to respond to those recommendations and to those in particular. One recommendation which was supported by the Liberal amendments to their Bill 30, and that, of course, was defeated by the NDP, and again the amendments to Bill 102, again defeated by the NDP, and included in the Bill 106, the Liberal bill, asked, and I quote, "The Governor-General shall direct the Minister of Education, the Minister of Justice, and any other members to enter into negotiations with the Government of Canada with the purpose of making changes to the criminal code with regard to addressing inappropriate behaviour and bullying by the electronic means, including Internet and cell telephone service." And I will table that. Over 1 year has passed, and only today has the Premier finally acknowledged that maybe there's a need to work with the federal government on the criminal code. This is 1 year too late. So my question to the Minister, will the Minister acknowledge today that her inaction has done nothing to help families bring bullies to justice?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Since that was his comment was directed towards the Premier, I would like to ask if it would be okay if the Premier could speak to that. Thank you.
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just point out that none of those bills were defeated because they did not, in fact, come forward to a vote. The reality is that there is a constant ongoing exchange between the departments here and the federal government about the kinds of changes that we see as necessary, whether it's with the criminal code or with other pieces of legislation, and certainly the Minister of Justice would have those kinds of conversations with his federal counterpart. I would just point out, Mr. Speaker, that as it is now, Nova Scotia is a leader in this country in its approach to cyberbullying and in bullying, has one of the best regimes anywhere in the country. We used a process and essentially a commission to look at that issue and thoroughly examine it. And we took the benefit of that advice and we brought forward legislation and made policy decisions in that regard. So, Mr. Speaker, people in Nova Scotia should be proud of the record of the government of Nova Scotia with respect to this. We acknowledge, and I hope everyone does, that things are always going to change. More information will come forward. We will see events happen that challenge our ability to be able to deal with them. But we do not shy away from them. We accept that and we work toward better and more complete answers.
The Honourable Member for Colchester. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the more important recommendations of the Cyberbullying Task Force, the Dr. Wayne McKay report, was that cyberbullying, a new and devastating phenomenon in our province and around the world, ought to be defined in law, including provincially, Mr. Speaker, where the consequences, including restitution, can be spelled out for those that engage in cyberbullying. So I will ask the Premier, in light of that report, in light of the bills that have been brought before this House before to actually put a definition of cyberbullying into law so people can recognize it for the offence that it is, will the Premier commit now to defining cyberbullying in Nova Scotia law and spelling out the consequences for those that engage in it?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I pointed out already, we have a constant ongoing dialogue with the federal government around issues like cyberbullying. Obviously, if it is to be a criminal offence, then it must be defined in the Criminal Code of Canada, which would be something that I'm sure the federal government already has this on its radar, because I know that we have been working through the Department of Justice to bring these issues to their attention. I know that the Minister of Justice is certainly aware that legislation needs to evolve to address new events, and so that's what we're doing.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the time for dialogue is over and the time for strong action is now. There are many offences defined in law provincially, and cyberbullying should be one of them. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the time has come to give our courts and law enforcement officials the power to confiscate cell phones, laptops, and other electronic devices when they are used as weapons against our own children. And so I will ask the Premier, will he bring in legislation to give the courts and law enforcement officials the power to take away laptops and cell phones and other electronic devices when they are used in such a destructive manner?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't believe the jurisdiction of the courts are limited in that regard. Mr. Speaker, anything that is used in the commission of a criminal act, I believe, would be capable of being confiscated. But I take the question very seriously. What I want the leader of the Conservative Party to know is that there is obviously a review of these matters that are necessary. We're going to look at it in a comprehensive fashion, and we'll be doing so over the next little while.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that answer from the Premier. I will say that he may believe that the courts and law enforcement officials and others have all the tools that they need, but they are not being confiscated now in these kinds of situations, and they should be. So I hope he does bring a review and actual actions that we can all take together to stop cyberbullying in its tracks. The McKay Task Force was a very comprehensive task force on the issue of bullying and cyberbullying. It consulted with a great number of Nova Scotians and produced a wide number of recommendations. Government has adopted them piecemeal when, in fact, it represents a comprehensive whole. I will ask the Premier if he will commit today to implementing all of the recommendations of the McKay Task Force so we can together get on with the job of stopping bullying and cyberbullying and the effects that it's having on young people.
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we thanked Mr. McKay for his review. We took all of the recommendations seriously. We didn't implement them piecemeal. In fact, we accepted the vast majority of those recommendations. They were implemented, the ones that we believe could be effectively implemented by the provincial government, and we did that in an expeditious fashion.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, parents, teachers and communities across Nova Scotia have been put through a heart-wrenching process reviewing schools for closure. Last week, after hundreds of hours of work, including community meetings and board deliberations, the Minister of Education stepped in and requested the boards call off these reviews. Last year, on April 11, 2012, the Minister of Education refused to intervene in a review because, and I quote, "Under the legislative process, the school review is very clearly mandated and is not to be interfered with by the Minister. The school review process is a very clearly articulated process where parents and communities have an opportunity on two separate occasions to offer their input in the process and to the board." Mr. Speaker, it seems that the Minister and this government stood behind the school review process enough not to get involved last year. So my question to the Premier, at what point did the government decide that the school review process was flawed?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, school reviews and the allocation of budgets and assets are the responsibility of the school boards of our province. We elect them, their communities elect them to do this job, and of course we support those boards in their work. The review process in this province, in fact, has been altered a number of times, as the Leader of the Opposition would likely know. Unfortunately, they have become increasingly adversarial, and we don't like that. We want communities to be able to make good decisions around the allocation of the assets that we have. I'm sorry, is there a further question there? So, Mr. Speaker, so I believe what we are attempting to do with this is we made the request to the boards, and it was a request to suspend the current reviews in order that we might work with them to find a less adversarial way to do what it is that they are trying to achieve, which is get the best balance for communities in terms of the assets, in terms of capital expenditure, in terms of the operating revenue that they, or the operating funds that they have to provide the best possible educational service.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Speaker, the school review process is no more adversarial this year than it was last year, Mr. Speaker, and yet the board last year and the minister and the government support it. And, Mr. Speaker, school boards across this province last September went about doing their business, Mr. Speaker, doing what they've been elected to do, as the Premier said, and they've been doing it to follow legislation that has been put in place, Mr. Speaker, by this government and reviewed by the Minister of Education, Mr. Speaker, back in 2010. So, Mr. Speaker, School Boards Association stated that the minister's request could be all but a moot point because of legalities on the board decision. Even before the association raised this point, boards, including the Socio-Regional, were skeptical that they could heed the minister's snap request because they simply can't afford to maintain schools' needs so that they can stay open and pay teachers and students support, Mr. Speaker. The government has said, Mr. Speaker, they are not going to provide any more money to school boards. So my question to the Premier, how is the Premier going to protect classrooms in the wake of the minister's about-face?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the minister did exactly what she should do. She waited for the completion of the process. It came to an end, I believe, the last day of March. Within a day or so, the minister made the request of the boards. That is as it should be. This year, the boards will get more money than they got last year, and, Mr. Speaker, they will receive this year the highest per capita funding in our province's history.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if this process was flawed, the minister should have stepped in at the very beginning instead of putting community and school boards through what is a very difficult and gut-wrenching experience, Mr. Speaker. And I want to remind the Premier, Mr. Speaker, the Socio-Regional School Board is not getting more money, Mr. Speaker. 5 out of the 8 boards in this province have seen a reduction, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians know this about faced by the Minister and the NDP government is in the school review process is simply electioneering, Mr. Speaker. If this government was truly committed to improving the school review process, it would not have waited, Mr. Speaker, until there were 3.5 years into the majority mandate to do so, Mr. Speaker. They would have funded public education so boards could have had the option of keeping schools open and supporting all students, Mr. Speaker. It's bad enough that the Premier has tried to balance the budget on the backs of children, Mr. Speaker. Now he's playing politics with their education. Will the Premier admit to communities, teachers and parents and students that his government's request to call off the review was just an empty political maneuver with no real commitment to help communities keep their schools open?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, quite the opposite. What the people of Nova Scotia know is that in working with the NDP government, that we are always prepared to listen to them and to their community, that we take very, very seriously the responsibility that we find ourselves with in terms of the finances of the province, but we balance those with our desire to improve services to our citizens. You only have to look at this year's balanced budget where it is not only balanced financially, it is also balanced in that we are extending more services like the early years centres that we announced this morning, like insulin pumps, like putting more money back into the hands of senior citizens. I mean, these are all things that improve the quality of life in our province, and the best thing that the opposition could do to support that would be to vote for the budget, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On April 3rd, 2 days after the school review process was finished, the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development wrote school boards to request the school review process for the 2013-14 be suspended. And, Mr. Speaker, it got some headlines. Later that day, the same minister said she's not able to interfere, and all she can do is ask the school board if they'll honour the requests, and I'll table that article. My question to the Minister of Education is, how will the school board stop the school review process?
Honourable the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much. The school review process for the upcoming year would start in October and end in March. So I've asked them to suspend identifying schools for the upcoming school year because it is it would be starting in October and ending in March. So I've asked for a suspension in the review process while we work through a better way. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Yesterday, the President of the Nova Scotia School Boards Association said the minister's request has left them with more questions than answers. He said the Education Act dictates that the decision of boards with this regard is final. So boards have questions about whether they have the leeway to reverse this or not, and I'll table that article. So my question to the minister is, does the minister honestly believe the school boards can do anything to stop the school review process and keep schools already slated for closure open?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That is why I made the request of the board to suspend the process and to delay the decisions that were made in the current year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister put parents, teachers, students, communities and school board members through a nightmare process, and then at the 11th hour asked the school boards to do something she knew that was not even possible. Some school boards had already made decisions about the fate of their small rural schools. So my question to the minister is, will she please stop spreading false hope to the Nova Scotians who were led to believe that maybe her announcement meant something when it was really just political posturing to grab a newspaper headline?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We've listened to school boards and parents and communities around this process. I have asked for the school boards to suspend the process. It's a request that they've asked themselves, Mr. Speaker. We are listening to Nova Scotians. We want to move forward in a more positive, collaborative way and make sure that community's voice and the school boards can work together collaboratively. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year on April the 11th, 2012, the Minister of Education stood in this House and talked about the school review process, and she said, and I quote, "The school review process is a very clearly articulated process where parents and community have the opportunity on 2 separate occasions to offer their input in the process and to the board." And Mr. Speaker, I will table that. Last week, when speaking of the very same process, the very same minister said, and I quote, "The process was adversarial and heartbreaking," and I will table that. So my question to the minister, here's a complete contradiction. Will the Minister of Education tell members of this House when she had that change of heart, when she had the recent flip-flop, and when this all came to light?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The school review process is a very clearly articulated process that is problematic and adversarial. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Well, I'll give the minister credit. She's taken 2 contradictory quotes of her own and put them together into a new one. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education spent nearly $1 million on ads and promotions while wait lists for accessing speech-language pathology and school psychology were growing. It's the same minister who slashed funding to school boards and offered no additional supports to cover increasing cost, and then turns around and asks them to halt their decisions. So on behalf of communities, parents and teachers, my question to the minister is this: what does the minister suggest that boards cut in order to fulfill her latest political whim?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We very clearly heard from the communities that the process was problematic It was not doing what the intention was, to review schools to the benefit of our children, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the school board so we can move forward in a positive way. Thank you.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development had a chance to reassure parents that they will continue to have choice in what kind of childcare they want for their children. When she had a chance to be clear, she waffled. When given an opportunity to bring clarity to the confusion her predecessor created on the file, Mr. Speaker, she ducked. And yesterday, during estimates, the minister muddied the water further by saying that Nova Scotians are seeing the beginning of a big shift. So my question through you to the minister, will the minister be clear today? Will she tell parents and small business owners what this government's plans are for childcare?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And this was a very important day for Nova Scotians, because this is the day that we were able to discuss how we are going to be shifting philosophically how we take care of our youngest citizens. So today we announced that we are going to be providing an integrated service model in the department, working collaboratively along with our stakeholders in that process and our advisory committee. So I want to say that as we move forward, this is we are going to be setting up some initial sites. But while this is happening, it will be business as usual in the province of Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, let me break this down to help the minister. In December 2011, the minister who used to be responsible for childcare attended a press conference with CUPE, where she said her department had begun discussing phasing out public funding for private operators. And the minister said, and I quote, "It takes a long time to change a system, but I think there's a great appreciation in government that something needs to be done." And I will table that, Mr. Speaker. So my question to you, to the minister, will the minister tell us today if the former minister was incorrect when she said that the NDP was bringing socialised daycare to Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's very important that we recognize that it is imperative that we support our youngest citizens in this province. We need to make sure that from birth until our children enter school and throughout the system, that we provide every opportunity for them to be successful. The announcement today is providing an opportunity for Nova Scotians. There's going to be a shift with the integration of our services. We have created a new department. Under one roof, we will be able to serve the needs of our children, as I said, from primary forward. There is no change in delivery of service in the province of Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, back in February, 2 months ago, the Deputy Minister of Community Services appeared at the Standing Committee on Community Services. What he said was exactly opposite to what the minister said at the CUPE news conference. He said, and I quote, "There's no planning around, in fact, actually moving away from our existing model." And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. Today, the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development told reporters that childcare funding is under review. So my question through you to the minister, who was right and who got it wrong? Is there an NDP plan to change the funding model for childcare, or isn't there?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have it right.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, last year the federal government expected revenues to grow by 6%. However, they have had to downgrade their revenue growth projections now to 3.8%. In short, Mr. Speaker, the federal government has had to adjust its tax base estimates downward, and with that, the feds are expecting lower revenue growth. This realistic adjustment is in stark contrast to what the Finance Minister is telling Nova Scotians today about our revenue projections. My question, Mr. Speaker, is with the province expecting to lose 1,100 jobs in the next year and clear indications of a slowing economy, where is the Finance Minister finding an extra $145 million in new personal tax revenues?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, private sector economists at all of the major financial institutions review Nova Scotia's budget economic assumptions, and they compare them against their own forecasts, Mr. Speaker. And in addition to that, the Conference Board of Canada, Apex economists and economists here in the universities all look at the economic assumptions of the department. And having done that, Mr. Speaker, they concur with the assumptions of the department, and that formulates the estimates, the fiscal forecast of our budget, a balanced budget that restores really important services like the children's dental program that were cut by the Liberals in the 1990s.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Speaker, standing behind assumptions and so on is flying in the face of a lot of the facts that I'm bringing today. We're forecasting in the budget a 0.2% decline in employment next year. Just as important to note, the labour income growth last year was slower than it was even during the recession. And the downgraded GDP growth, because of downgraded GDP growth, the federal government is expecting revenues to be a full $17 billion lower than were predicted in the fall. All of these are facts, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we too are facing a slowing economy, and nominal GDP is only expected to grow 2.3% in 2013 and 3% in 2014. With all of these facts affecting the tax base, it's very difficult for us to understand, Mr. Speaker, how the Finance Minister can provide a lot of baffle-gab about how she's going to achieve this overly estimated revenue future. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Finance tell Nova Scotians how provincial income tax revenue can be expected to grow at a whopping rate of 7% in the medium term when nominal GDP growth rates are forecast to only be 2.3% and 3% respectively?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, all of the economists in the big financial institutions in the country looked at the assumptions that were put together by the economists in the Department of Finance, and they compared those assumptions with their own forecasts, and they find the assumptions to be reasonable. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, they found the assumptions in the Department of Finance to be conservative compared to their forecasts for the coming year. Many economists in this country are looking at Nova Scotia's economy in the coming year and out into the next year as being growth in the middle of the Canadian provinces for the first time in many, many years, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, this is the result of a number of very positive projects that are on the horizon. This province is turning the corner with the shipbuilding contract, with the building of the Nova Centre, with the investment in IT by IBM, Mr. Speaker. There are many positive job opportunities for Nova Scotians that will contribute to the GDP growth of this province, good jobs and good taxes that we can reinvest in programs for kids, seniors and small business, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, according to a Freedom of Information request received in our office last month, more than 3,000 Nova Scotians, 3,132 to be exact, are waiting for hip and knee replacements in our province. Of these 3,000 plus patients, over half of them, 55% of them have been waiting more than the national benchmark of 6 months. In fact, Mr. Speaker, a national report card produced last summer by the Canadian White Times Alliance gave Nova Scotia an F for our effort in knees, a D for hip replacement, foot and ankle, of course, is off the charts. Some of the worst grades in the country. What specific action is the minister taking now to address the fact that 1,709 Nova Scotians have been waiting 6 months for their orthopedic surgery?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Access to health care services is a priority for this government. Our goal is to ensure that Nova Scotians can gain access, especially to the surgeries they need, Mr. Speaker, as quickly as possible. We know we need to work on the wait times for orthopedic surgeries. That's why I'm proud that we just recently announced an investment of an additional $2 million to increase the number of orthopedic surgeries that we could do over a weekend to really address those individuals who have been waiting over a year, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work in that fashion to ensure that Nova Scotians get access to the surgeries they need.
Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, even with the planned 350 surgeries, they never all got completed before March 31st. There are still over 500 patients on the wait list who have been waiting for more than 1 year. We have 1,700 plus patients waiting longer than 6 months, another 500 who have been waiting longer than 1 year. Mr. Speaker, something is not working here. Could the minister please tell Nova Scotians waiting in pain for their orthopedic surgery why the NDP plan for health care continues to fail them?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Quite the contrary, Mr. Speaker. It was the Liberal health plan of the 90s that failed Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Our Better Care Sooner plan has made a real impact on improving the services that Nova Scotians get within the health care system, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to work in that fashion.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on February 24, 2010, an announcement of the Target 100 program was made by the Premier and the Minister of Community Services. At the time of the announcement, the Premier commented that this program was designed to connect real people with real jobs in their community, and not just any jobs, but good jobs with benefits, profit sharing and opportunities. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister tell the House today how many community services recipients have benefited from the good jobs with benefits?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question, because the Target 100 program is a very important program. I believe that we're well up in the high, around 48, 50 in the numbers, and it's a program that is different than others because it is being run by the cooperative, and plus the other factor is that it's a higher level of employment for individuals coming off of income assistance. It often puts them like in an assistant management position. So it has been a program that has been working well for those who are involved. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, at the time of the announcement, the Co-op Council stated that over the next few years it will have hundreds of vacant positions to fill. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's been 3 years. My question to the Minister, why hasn't her department been successful in reaching the target of 100?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I mentioned in the first time, is that the fact is that the program is actually being run by the cooperative, and we support the cooperative through the clientele that has the that we feel have the ability and the education or initiative that they want to go forward with this. So if there's an agreement that with the clientele that they want to be involved in this program, and so we support them from that angle, and then the cooperative supports them in finding the work and ensuring that they have the monitoring and support to make it successful for them. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we all know that the Minister of Economic and Rural Development doesn't believe in targets, and the NDP track record on actual job creation has been abysmal. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister tell the House today what changes her department will make to ensure the success of this program in future so that we can connect those real people with real jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, this government and this minister and the Department of Community Services and our hardworking staff are doing many things that have never been done in the province before. Not only are we working with Target 100, but we're looking at the whole ESIA, which is the Employment Income Program, which hasn't been looked at, and we're looking at it in a variety of different areas, and including the employability of individuals, and we're working with LAE also. So we are doing things very differently. We're doing them in a holistic manner, bringing departments together and providing opportunities that neither party ever thought of looking at when they were in government. And so we are moving forward with changes that are good, and we'll see a difference in this province because we've already seen it. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't like to go back too far in political history because Nova Scotians don't want us to go back to when we were in power in '99. They're going to judge this government on its ineffectiveness for the past 4 years. But just for the record, Mr. Speaker, the last time the Liberals were in government, the orthopedic wait time was 4 months. Well, Mr. Speaker, my question is again for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Late last month, Nova Scotia lost a bright young orthopedic surgeon. Dr. Andrea Belkovich went to Toronto. Having been in the Valley for 2 years, her wait list grew to 1,300 patients. Mr. Speaker, there are not too many specialists like Dr. Belkovich out there. In addition to ortho procedures, she specialized in minimally invasive orthopedic surgery for people with diabetes. A demand, Mr. Speaker, which will only grow in this province, not diminish. She was young, bright and innovative, apparently just too bright and innovative for this NDP government. With wait lists exceeding 3,000 patients with our own patient load of 1,300, how could the minister afford to let Dr. Belkovich go?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we can't afford, Mr. Speaker, is a Liberal government. Back in the 90s, Nova Scotians will remember, Mr. Speaker. Health care workers will remember, Mr. Speaker, and they can pretend it didn't happen, but it happened. We're going to continue to invest in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. We have the first physician resource plan in the province's history, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals didn't bring one in. The Conservatives never brought one in, Mr. Speaker, because we need to ensure that we have the right mix of physicians in this province, Mr. Speaker, so we can improve services for all Nova Scotians. So we're going to continue to work to ensure that Nova Scotians have access to the right doctors that they need, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to work with all district health authorities to ensure that people have access to the surgeries they need.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think the minister is hearing the alarm bells going that the physician resource plan doesn't quite monitor the true clinical footprint of this province. Mr. Speaker, this is a surgeon that wanted to stay. The district asked the department for the financial resources to keep her, and the answer from the NDP government was no. So much for autonomous local decision by DHAs, Mr. Speaker. We have an NDP government that can find over $1 million for the self-promoting TV ads yet no money to keep an orthopedic surgeon here in the province. Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell us why self-promotion is more important to this government than keeping an orthopedic surgeon to deal with our wait times?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm trying to contain my laughter, Mr. Speaker, because if the Liberal Party was so concerned with health care, why in the world is health care called fourth in estimates in this chamber? Something I've never seen in 10 years, Mr. Speaker. We're working extremely hard to improve services for Nova Scotians, and Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to work in that manner. The Liberals have a track record in health, and Nova Scotians will remember it.
The Honourable Member for Preston.
Mr. Speaker, when the NDP broke their agreement with municipalities and tore up the MOU, they said that there would be no costs associated with this decision. In fact, on April 5, 2011, the minister stated there would be no changes whatsoever. This should not impact their bottom line. And then again, on April 6, 2012, the minister said the municipalities are actually better off under these arrangements. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations still believe that there's been no impact on the bottom line and that municipalities are better off after they've torn up the MOU?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, to set the record straight, we didn't tear up the MOU, Mr. Speaker. We actually followed the MOU, and the financial position of municipalities across this province. Coming out of the changes that we made to the MOU, Mr. Speaker, they are better off than when they entered the MOU, and so I stand by my previous comments that it had no negative financial impact to municipalities, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Preston on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what we have heard from the municipalities is that the minister has impacted the bottom line in all the municipalities across the province. For example, the minister tore up the MOU. That meant that municipalities had to come up with extra funding for education, which was not budgeted for. In fact, in HRM, the municipality is facing an $8 million increase in education costs because of the minister's reckless decision. Mr. Speaker, HRM faces an $8 million increase for education costs due to the minister's decision. Does he still think there was no impact to the bottom line and that municipalities are better off after tearing up the MOU?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, the member opposite, I think, lives in the world. If I say it often enough, it must be true. Mr. Speaker, I know that the members opposite find that amusing to use the term turning the corner because they're used to going in circles, Mr. Speaker. They should be so lucky, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one thing that came out of the MOU, Mr. Speaker, was that the rate for education tax was held at the 10-11 level that they entered into the MOU. So therefore, and it used to be tied to CPI, and that's been removed. So really, the rate on the tax for education was held, and it's supposed to stay that way, I think, to 15-16 or 16-17. I can't remember. I can get that number for the members. So therefore, there really is no increase for those municipalities. The only thing that might cause the increase is if their assessment values go up, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Preston on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the assessments did go up. And the government is going to collect another $8 million for education costs That means a municipality would be forced in a position of raising extra revenue or cutting services. They have been forced into this decision because of the MOU. The province is going to assume more of these services that fall under provincial jurisdiction, which they refuse to do. Now the people of HRM are faced with higher taxes or further cuts to essential services. Mr. Speaker, the NDP government has already cut $76 million from the classrooms, while collecting an additional $8 million from HRM residents. Force and Regional Council will make tough decisions on essential services. Will the minister reverse this reckless decision and reinstate the MOU?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I wonder if you can tell me if delusional is unparliamentary.
Now, certainly it is.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll rephrase my intended answer. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite actually was the minister in charge of the department similar to this department, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to give him a little history lesson. That I think it was the Reagan government, but I could be wrong. But anyway, at one point in the past, a previous government really took over the funding for education. Prior to that, education funding was done at the local level. So the government took over that funding to the level of 85% of the costs, and now municipalities are responsible for about 15%. So when the member keeps saying that this is a provincial jurisdiction, what the province actually did was remove 85% of that education cost from local government, and they're left with 15%, which I think turned out to be a good thing for municipalities, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, from February 2009 to February 2013, the price of energy went up 44.5%. If we compare the 4 years before that to the price of energy, only went up 6.5%. Then, of course, Mr. Speaker, the previous government didn't use dirty imported coal to produce energy. During the 4-year comparison, there's a 37.9% difference in percentage increases. Mr. Speaker, that's horrendous. The NDP have inflated the price of energy to the most expensive in the country, and the price of their solution is well unknown. Yet small and medium-sized businesses and everyday Nova Scotians are left wondering why there are no jobs. Mr. Speaker, the province is not open for business. My question to the Ministry of RT is, will he admit not only that has the NDP jobs where failed, but they have created a perfect storm of economic breakdown?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that we've created a good environment for businesses right across the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians, for the first time in 20 years, are optimistic about their future, Mr. Speaker. The big projects that we've got on the horizon, Mr. Speaker, the Maritime Link, the Nova Centre, the ships project, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the fact that we've got projects, the West coming east, Mr. Speaker, IBM building a centre of excellence that could have been anywhere in the world. They chose Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the horizon has never been brighter in 20 years, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if we look at the CPI in general for the last 4 years and the 4 years preceding that, the percentage increases are 11.7% and 6.9% respectively. That means that all items within the CPI have increased by 4.7% more than the 4 years before the NDP started their reign of terror. This means there's less disposable income for consumers and more expensive conditions for business operators. Shelter increased by an additional 1% from the 4 years before, clothing 7.7%, goods 9.5%, and transportation 20.6%. Mr. Speaker, these numbers are significant, Now, if the NDP had their way, I'm sure they would be hidden along with their $27 million error. Mr. Speaker, my question: will the minister apologize for making life harder for Nova Scotians and adopt policies that actually grow the economy and create jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. In Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is indeed a pleasure to rise on my feet and talk about all the opportunities that have been created for Nova Scotians in the past 4 years. Mr. Speaker, just very recently, after the good Minister of Finance tabled her budget here in the House, she went to Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker, and she addressed the Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Speaker. As a result of that, the Chamber was quoted in the Cape Breton Post. Bear with me, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to table this. And guess what the Chamber of Commerce said? Okay. Now this is by Paula Gallagher, Mr. Speaker, who is chairwoman of the Chamber of Commerce. And I quote, McDonald's said, this is from the Cape Breton Post, and it's dated March the 28th, 2013. McDonald's said, one of the major initiatives of the April the 4th budget will be a plan to simplify access to programs for small business. She also said the small business tax would be cut 0.5 percentage point to 3%, the lowest rate in 20 years. And I quote, the budget reflects the fact that the minister in the government had listened to what matters to the business community. Paula Gallagher, Mr. Speaker.
I'd like to remind all the members it's improper to refer to another member by their name in any way during any proceedings in the House. I did hear the name McDonald in that statement. I think you're referring to the Minister of Finance. This includes notices of motion and while reading from documents such as newspaper stories. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for bringing that to my attention, and I retract that.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, I wonder if she also told the minister also told the chamber about lowering the threshold during that budget. Mr. Speaker, from February 2009, Nova Scotia's increase in CPI was 10.8% nationally. It was only 7.8%. In the 4 years prior, Nova Scotia increased by 7.4%, and nationally we increased by 7.7%. Remember the days we had economic statistics that were lower than the national average, but in a good way? 4 years is a long time, and Nova Scotians are sick of this government's mishandling of our economy. Nova Scotia has the third lowest percentage increase in weekly wages, and almost 2% lower than the national average. So my question is the minister, will the minister commit to scrapping the failed NDP economic plan and provide relief for taxpayers who need a break?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to acknowledge that the member opposite recognized that we do have a plan. The plan is called Jobs Here, and it is working, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are about to turn the corner. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, you don't have to take my word for it. I want to read another quote for you. And this says, and I'm not going to start from the very beginning, but it says, referring to this government, it says, great changes in approach for making it easier for businesses to get support and connect with the right agencies and services. It will be important to get the word out, as this is quite a significant change to how business is done in the province, especially how businesses interface with government. We will do what we can to spread the word. Mr. Speaker, that is from Darlene Grant Fyander, President of Tyans, Mr. Speaker, and I'll table that.
The Honourable Member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question today is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, back in 2007, the Municipal Council in Clare forwarded a proposal to the Department of Health to ask government to replace the existing long-term care facility of Villa Acadienne, which opened back in 1974 in Meteghan. Villa Acadienne, Mr. Speaker, opened around the same time as the Tideview Terrace in Digby, the Tidalview Manor in Yarmouth. These two long-term care facilities have both been replaced in recent years. So my first question to the Minister is, has his department made a decision yet on replacing the Villa Acadienne?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for bringing that forward. I know we recently met in my office where the member brought this to my attention, the concerns of his community. My commitment was to him as soon as I can and as possible get down to see the Villa Acadienne down in his area, in his riding, because I've tried to do that on a number of occasions across the province. I've said in the past that the government is going to continue to be involved in replacement of long-term care facilities. We're going to continue to be involved in renovating current and existing long-term care facilities, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to assess the needs in the community, also with the investment that we are making in long-term care and home care, and we'll be making those decisions as we move forward and implement the budget.
The Honourable Member for Clare on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2011, the department staff started a review of existing long-term care facilities in order to develop a priority list for the department. So again, to the Minister of Health and Wellness, could the Minister please tell us whether the review is completed, and if so, will the Minister table the replacement priority list before the end of business today?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know the demographic shift and change that we're seeing here in Nova Scotia. That's why, as a government, we need to ensure that we change policies. We ensure that services are there for seniors. And long-term care is one of those areas where we need to continue to look at investing in, but also ensuring that seniors in our province have options. So they have options if they need to go into a long-term care facility, but also more importantly, and from what I've been hearing, and I know many members of my caucus have been hearing from Nova Scotians, especially seniors, is that they want to stay in their homes longer. So we're going to continue to move forward on both fronts, ensuring that long-term care facilities are there in communities across the province, but ensuring that the services like home care are there for seniors also, so that they have good options for the care and the residents and the support they need as they get older here in our province.
The Honourable Member for Clare on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in recent months, I have received copies of letters from individuals from Clare who have written the Minister looking for an update as to when the Department of Health and Wellness will decide to move forward with replacing the Villa Acadienne. So my final question to the Minister, does the Minister know when the Department will decide to go ahead and replace the Villa Acadienne in Meteghan?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know the member brings this question forward because he's concerned about the seniors in his community. And as a government, we're concerned about seniors in all communities across the province. That's why we're continuing to look at where we need to invest, not only in replacing long-term care facilities, but renovating them and ensuring that they have the appropriate facilities across the province. It's been a challenge, Mr. Speaker, over the last 4 years. We know that the finances of the province haven't been great. The Conservative Party that was in power for 10 years left us with a financial mess that we had to clean up, and I was very glad to see that our government introduced the balanced budget, because it gives us more options to entertain organizations. It gives us more options to look at projects like the Villa Acadienne and replacement of that, Mr. Speaker, into the future. And I know the member will look forward to any announcements that we have as we unroll the budget over the next coming months.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The CBRM's proposed capital plan involves investment of $300 million to tackle major challenges related to decaying community infrastructure, significant wastewater upgrades that are required, as well as facilities, recreation and fleet modernization programs. During a speech to the Sydney and Area Chamber of Commerce last Friday, the Minister of Finance congratulated the CBRM and stated that their capital plan was, quote, interesting. So my question, can the Deputy Premier confirm that the CBRM capital plan has been considered during his government's budget deliberations, and have allegations been set aside to leverage federal infrastructure dollars?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, our budget was well finished by the time that came out. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the federal infrastructure funding was announced on March 27th. The CBRM capital plan was released long before that, and the prepayments to universities took place on March 28th. So, in fact, that is not accurate what the Deputy Premier just said. If the entire province is to benefit from mega projects on the horizon, then a sound, fact-based decision to support local employment is both financially prudent and good public policy, Mr. Speaker. If municipalities can construct plans that capitalize on 25-cent provincial dollars, then this will provide our communities with a chance to stem the tide of rural out-migration. So my question to the Deputy Premier, does he agree that the proposed CBRM plan could serve as a template for employing Nova Scotians while global, national and provincial economies recover and return to health?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it's an interesting proposal we received from in kind of a shell from the municipality, and we'd be looking forward to see exactly where it is. But you know what, Mr. Speaker, I don't know where the member was last fall, if he slept through it or not, but that's when our capital plan was put forward, and this fall we'll put another one forward, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Premier sees what I see when he's home in the Waterford. He sees what 18.6% unemployment looks like, Mr. Speaker. He sees the impact of families travelling out west and the impact that has on the family unit. He knows that the CBRM cannot afford the $90 million required for wastewater upgrades in the next few years, and he feels the societal impacts that occur when families leave and never return to Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker, as do you. So my question to the Deputy Premier, understanding both the challenges and potential for our island, will the Deputy Premier stand in his place today and endorse the CBRM capital plan?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what I will endorse is this government's investment in Port Hawkesbury, in the mill in Port Hawkesbury, which that party was against, Mr. Speaker. That's why I've endorsed. I will endorse, Mr. Speaker, Muskrat Falls, which we're for, and they're against, Mr. Speaker. I will support the dredging of Sydney Harbour, Mr. Speaker. But one thing I want to endorse, Mr. Speaker, when that member was with the federal member and there was unemployment rates of 21.8%, and they slept through that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, the mayors, wardens and chief administrative officers of the Strait area have raised concerns over a decision by the NDP to move from 12 regional development authorities to 6 regional enterprise networks to carry out economic development initiatives in Nova Scotia. Speaker, the Strait area, which includes municipal units within the counties of Richmond, Inverness, Guysborough and Antigonish, have a long history of working together on many fronts. They are concerned that having the Strait area divided between 2 regional enterprise networks will weaken the focus on economic development in the Strait. So my question to the Minister is, will the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism advise whether his government is open to the proposal for a Strait area regional enterprise network?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I think one thing that all Nova Scotians want is strong, economic, viable communities. And one of the things about that it should be known when it comes to the regional enterprise networks is that this is led by the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities, Mr. Speaker. We are one of the stakeholders with this, and the downsizing of the RDAs was certainly one of the recommendations that was put forth a few years ago by Donald Savoy. The municipalities thought that this was an appropriate avenue to go, and certainly as far as we, the government, are concerned, we're open to listen to anything. The door hasn't been closed on anything yet, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to hear that response. Speaker, projects such as the Melford Container Terminal, the proposed Bearhead liquid natural gas site, and possible expansion of New Star Terminal in Point Tupper present exciting possibilities for the economy of the Strait area. Yet having the Strait divided between two regional enterprise networks, one for all of Cape Breton Island and one for Guysborough, Antigonish and Pictou counties, will certainly weaken the focus of these projects and others for the Strait area. So my question to the Minister is the Minister prepared to meet with the mayors, wards and chief administrative officers of the municipal units in the Strait area to explore the possibility of a standalone Strait area regional enterprise network?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the member opposite will recall meetings that I certainly had in his writing, requests made on his behalf, and I will say that one of the things that I've continually boasted about, and maybe the only thing I boast about, is that I consider myself as the most accessible member in government, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. So the answer is yes.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, in 2005, the former NDP Minister of Finance and member for Halifax Fairview understood bracket creep. And if I may quote, it was said at the time, there is no increase in the income tax rates, but let's make no mistake about it, this budget includes an increase in income tax, but it does it indirectly, not directly. There are two principal ways the government is doing that, and one is that there is no inflation indexing of the tax brackets. So while inflation marches along, the tax brackets do not. Simply put, virtue of inflation, more people moving into a higher tax bracket. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the current Minister of Finance, does the current Minister feel as if does the current Minister, if the NDP cared about bracket creep in 2005, why are they 0 for 4 in addressing the matter in their last 4 budgets?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I've been in this House for 15 years, and Mr. Speaker, one of the things that I do remember was when Premier Ham and the government of the day decoupled the federal and provincial income tax systems. That led to provincial income tax no longer being indexed, Mr. Speaker. So there's nothing new here. I don't know how many finance ministers we've had since that time, but I venture there have been 3 or 4 anyway, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, taxes support the services that Nova Scotians rely on. I'm very proud that this year we've been able to bring the province back to a balanced position. Mr. Speaker, we've been able to introduce some modest tax measures to provide relief to small businesses and to senior citizens and people who live with low incomes, Mr. Speaker. And that's quite an accomplishment, given the mess that this government inherited. But we will look into other tax measures in the future. But let's get this budget through, and I'll be looking forward to the support of the honourable member when that vote comes.
The honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the minister highlights the importance of keeping one's word here in the legislature. And I know for myself, I've always kept my word in here, which is something members on the opposite side haven't with respect to bracket creep. Also, Mr. Speaker, we also have to wonder about how the state of this province would be if Nova Scotians had to endure what these members opposite suggested we do when they voted against balanced budgets in the past 8 years before they inherited government. So that needs to be put on the record. But I want to quote, Mr. Speaker, one more time from the former Minister of Finance, and that is, let's make no mistake about it, this is a tax increase measure, the government's continuing refusal or inability to index tax brackets, and that is much of a tax grab as the Minister of Finance reaching into your pocket or into your wallet or into your purse and taking out the money. So my question for the Minister, Mr. Speaker, is does the current Minister of Finance feel as if she has reached into the wallets and purses of Nova Scotians and taken their money?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, this Finance Minister is very proud that we are investing in services with this budget. We are restoring the cuts that the Liberal Party made to the children's dental program in the mid-90s, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are providing insulin pumps and supplies to young adults who have insulin pumps, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have invested to ensure that ambulance fees are reduced in long-term care facilities, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have ensured that class sizes are capped for our children in grade primary to grade 3, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are providing...
Order, please. Order. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. I will now look at the House Leader for the Progressive Conservative Party to call business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope I'm looking pretty good. Can you call Bill number 6, Next Generation Act, please?
Bill number 6, the Next Generation Act. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always good to see a Spring Hiller in the gallery, and I'm wondering if I might be permitted a quick introduction as I begin my remarks.
If you feel like it.
I do, Mr. Speaker. I just happen to look up and see Mr. Rick Clark, the President of the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour, and a Spring Hiller in the gallery. And
is that where he's from?
I don't know if they noticed him.